worries. Okay, well then let's go ahead and get started. You're not the only one. Boris from FedEx is also having issues joining, so it may just be the three of us on the session today. But let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. This session today is titled Fleet Manager Approved Driving Internal Buy-in. And today we're going to be chatting with a few major corporate fleet operators and fleet electrification experts about best practices, as well as tools that you can use to gain internal corporate buy-in for a transition to electric vehicles, or EVs as we'll be calling them in session today for short. I am Sarah Forney. I'm the Director of Clean Vehicles at Ceres. We're a sustainability advocacy nonprofit organization, and I lead our Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance, which is a platform for major global and US companies. And two of our panelists today, Ken and Boris from Verizon, and actually, sorry, Ken and Megan are representatives of CEVA for their companies. And we're working towards fleet-wide electrification in the US. So I'm thrilled to be the moderator for this fantastic panel we have here today, which includes Megan Weinman, who is a managing director at Edison Energy and leads its transportation electrification practice. She oversees the team that provides advisory services to organizations as they consider EVs and charging for their fleets and business operations. And that ranges from developing EV strategies and roadmaps for those fleets, large-scale charging infrastructure programs, to full turnkey solutions. We're also joined today by Ken Jack, who is the VP of Fleet Operations at Verizon. Ken is responsible for all procurement, maintenance, operations, and policy related to Verizon's 40,000 plus North American fleet. And in this role, he also ensures alignment of fleet activities with corporate shareholder and service delivery objectives. And I'm still going to introduce him even though he hasn't been able to join yet. But last but not least, we'll hopefully be joined by Boris Court-Packard, who is Chief Engineer, Global Vehicles for FedEx Express, where he is facilitating progress toward carbon neutral operations by 2040, focusing on a 100% transition to electric pickup and delivery vehicles. As FedEx Express's Chief Engineer on this work, he provides consulting vision and analysis to direct strategic leading edge fleet innovation and efficiency advances, including on e-cargo bikes and electric delivery vans. So we have some great panelists, obviously, for you here today, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of experience in the room. So before we get started, I wanted to cover a few admin-related notes. We are recording this session today, and the recording will be available on demand 3 weeks after the event. If you'd like to share the content with your colleagues or partners. We do have a tight session today, but as I mentioned earlier, we encourage you to add any questions you have to the Q&A box. That's you can access that. It's the fourth tab to the right on your right-hand panel, and we'll try to respond before the end of the breakout session. We do also encourage you to take the survey pinned at the top of the chat box. That's the fifth to the right tab at the end of the breakout to let us know how we did. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So based on the focus of this conference, I think it's safe to say that most of us here in the session know that a transition to EVs is critical, not only to address the growing climate crisis, but also to reduce transportation-related emissions that impact public health. But what you might not know is that the business case for electric fleets is growing significantly. It can offer significant cost benefits and other benefits to fleets, but the trick is getting the EV transition approved internally. So that's what we're here to talk about today with Ken and Megan and potentially Boris. Really excited to get started and share some best practices, tips, anecdotes with all of you in the hopes that it helps you electrify your own fleets or gives you a better idea of what corporate fleets are going through in the process of building out a transition plan and getting that internal approval to start buying EVs. Tell me, let's start with Ken. Why did you/your company, Verizon, decide to make a transition to EVs? What did you see as the benefits?
Thanks for that, Sarah, and thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody that joined us today. I think the biggest thing for Verizon, and this is public facing, so I'm not giving away any secrets. When you looked at our sustainability strategy and our commitments, broadly speaking, to achieve net zero operational emissions, vehicles was going to be an obvious piece of that. Something that most people don't necessarily think about for companies like Verizon and some other large technology providers is how much of their scope 2 emissions are really coming from electricity and purchase power that go into running data centers and big electric networks and things like that. So we're probably not your typical carbon footprint if you were to kind of segment the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. But that scope 1 emission coming from the vehicle is a very visible piece of the brand. So, materiality sometimes aside, there's a piece of it that we realize people aren't going to take us seriously on things that they can't see if they don't see, the things that kind of come intuitively to folks to see as part of that transition. And that includes, EVs and kind of greening our outward-facing operations. Taking it a step further and kind of working through all the other working groups, I imagine is part of, where the discussion will lead here in the next hour. How do you work that through all the different stakeholder groups internally? But that was really the nexus of it, was part of a broader overreaching, sustainability commitment that we've made externally. So.
That's great, Ken. And Megan, I know that you're not working on the fleet side of Edison International, but you are working with fleets to help them electrify outside of Edison Energy. So I'm interested in hearing, is that similar to what you're hearing from other fleets, that sustainability and reducing, various scope 3 emission or scope emissions, whether it's scope 1 or 2 or scope 1 or 3 is the priority here?
Yeah. And again, thanks for having us today, and great to be here with Ken. We were able to swap stories like a few months ago. It was really fun to hear kind of what was happening with Verizon and in the industry. So excited to share with the group here. For me too, and based on my experience, I'll just kind of back it up a little bit outside of just what I did with Edison Energy. Prior to coming to Edison Energy, I was working at Puget Sound Energy, which is an investor-owned utility in the Pacific Northwest, where I was launching EV programs. And, similar to what we're going to talk about today, it's not only, it's in part, and this is the thread that comes through, it's in part trying to get that in like buy-in and education with those that are going to be potentially using the vehicles, but really providing solutions that really meet a fleet's needs and meet an organization's needs. So at Edison Energy, we really work across the board. You said this in the intro. We meet fleets and we meet organizations where they are in their journey. We typically find, and we have a fantastic sustainability team at Edison Energy. We typically find the, origination comes from some sort of sustainability, carbon target, something that's really the overarching driver that is getting a fleet interested in electrification if they're trying to reduce those scope 1 emissions. That's where we typically see it start, but where it starts to evolve, and I'm sure Ken has lots of anecdotal experience here, is that it can't just stay within sustainability. You have to bring in so many different stakeholders within an organization. So obviously you have to bring in your fleet team, and then it starts to expand in terms of, it's not only your fleet team, it's your facilities team, because you're maybe going to have charging at your facilities. It's your energy team, it's your finance team, it's your purchasing team, like all of these different stakeholders that may have not had to work together previously are now having to align and work together around what is a sustainability target. The thing that we find often, and Sarah, I think you hit on this too, is that it may start with a sustainability target, but then it starts to uncover, potentially through analysis or roadmap development, or even just getting more electric vehicles into the fleet, becomes potentially a cost-saving exercise too, is like specifically fuel savings and maintenance savings. And there's all these other benefits that start to become uncovered that potentially started with a carbon target. So I'm sure we'll get into a lot of those in more details as we talk through some stories.
That's great, Megan. You made some really great points. And I'm also glad that you brought up the fact that getting internal buy-in isn't just about getting approval from all those various departments that are involved in this decision. It's also getting buy-in from your drivers. So I'd love to tap into that as well today, to hear what your thoughts are on that, both of you, and potentially Boris. Ken, I would love to hear more about, how you went about building a case internally to get that green light from various departments, what your priority department was, what your first stop was to building that case, And then after that, let's move into how you potentially worked around getting drivers on board. Uh-oh. You're still on mute. Hopefully. All right.
If you want me to jump in, Sarah, I don't mind doing
Yeah.
that while Ken
That'd be
goes.
great. Thank you.
I bet you his stories are gonna be way better than my stories. But I'll say that, kind of getting internal stakeholders on board. I think that a lot of times it's presenting information and meeting those stakeholders where they are. There's Ken right there.
So of course I unmuted as soon as there's an announcement. Sorry.
Yeah. Why don't you go while you're unmuted, and then I'll come on top of you.
Well, I think while it starts, as you mentioned, Sarah, with sort of a senior level, overarching commitment, and as Megan kind of alluded to, you also have all of these external stakeholders that you need to bring into that, right? So you've got your investment community, you've got community groups, folks that you interact with in the normal course of doing business. So that was a good kind of starting point. It was a good foundation. It was a linchpin in the strategy to say that we knew that there was a certain degree of support from the top. But then putting it into practices, as you said, really is much about change management and figuring out all the internal stakeholder groups. And so we kind of, we painted a picture of sort of what the future state, what we thought it looked like in terms of an operation that had gone fully EV, and then started working our way backwards and saying, okay, who are all the people that ended up being touched along the way? So it was our facilities group, the team that does our energy portfolio management, the people who procure the gas and electricity that run our operation. We thought about our operations teams and the concerns that they would have about their operation and the reliability and continuity, in terms of providing critical services. We thought about our maintenance teams, the folks who actually maintain all of the equipment and make sure it's able to go out every day. What kind of concerns will they have? What will the drivers think? So we kind of worked our way backwards and created this tree of folks that would have, they would have a touch point at some point in their workday related to EVs, and how are all of those stories different? And if you kind of fix a point in the future and say, I can see that, our anticipation is that we're going to have, our first EVs, up and in service, just here in the next few months. If we work backwards from those things, how much time did it take to kind of work through all those stakeholder teams? So to set up meetings with our facility teams and say, what is it that we need in terms of infrastructure at our facilities? To talk to our operations teams and say, what's a reasonable timeline in order to roll out that sort of change management, to work through sort of the discomfort that sometimes comes with it. We've got folks at every end of the spectrum, every corner of the room on the subject. We got people that can't wait to do it, and we've got people that are they're apprehensive about it. Then we've got folks that, may have a bit of a strange story, concocted in their heads about what this means and what it does and isn't. And, trying to give yourself enough time to work through all of those scenarios so that when it happens in real life, there's no group who is seeing it for the first time and say, well, everybody else knew about it, but I didn't know about it. And here's what, questions I have or what I'm uncomfortable about. So that's really been the journey for us over the last, year and a half or so. We still got more to do before these vehicles get here, but that's a big piece of it, that change management.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is an incredibly complex process, but also an exciting one. So like you mentioned, I imagine that a lot of, getting these senior decision makers on board involves not just developing this business case and presenting it to them, but also educating staff internally, drivers internally, to talk about why this is even an important move to make, why it's going to be a smart decision in the future in terms of the increased cost savings from fuel and maintenance savings. So, do you think that the most important element of this business case that you developed internally was around the potential cost savings and the return on investment, or what do you think was the major piece of the business case that you developed that was really a critical linchpin in this decision?
I think the answer is going to be a little bit different for every fleet in terms of kind of what is the core of their business and, what does the fleet account for in the conduct of that business. And for us, it is a certain piece of the business, and then we have lots of pieces of the business that have really nothing to do necessarily with the operation of a fleet. It's a little bit of everything. And again, like I said, some fleets are going to be focused certainly on the cost savings. Some are going to be looking at sort of the reduction in exposure to volatility and fuel price markets. Some are going to be thinking about sort of what it means from a customer engagement standpoint. Do your customers demand that you show up to service, and provide whatever services you provide as a company? Do they demand that you show up and provide that without a carbon footprint? So everybody has those factors, and the list goes on in terms of the factors you could kind of create. And the difference is sort of the weighting for each, I think for each company, they're going to weight those factors slightly differently and therefore be more focused on those things. So, cost savings is a piece of it for us. And I think certainly arguably in a lot of the segments that we're going to be able to electrify first, there's some good, leading indication from experience in sort of the retail and consumer space to say that there's going to be some good savings there, but it's not solely driven by that. Again, a lot of it goes back to sort of our carbon strategy and saying, we can't get to where we profess that we want to be and we feel is the right thing, for society, for the environment, for businesses to take the lead on without doing that. So we know that we're going to have to do those things.
And I would say too, Sarah, you hit on a couple, you both hit on a couple of points of, I loved hearing Verizon's experience about developing a business case, and just those listening sessions sounded fantastic. We find too that, getting those folks in a room early and developing that roadmap early is a key to success. And Sarah, one thing that you hit on was education. We find that when you have all those people in the room and you can, either do 101 sessions or education sessions all together, that can be really helpful so that everybody's on the same page and they're getting the information in the same sort of way. And every question is different because, Ken was talking a little bit about how do you get that buy-in? Your finance manager is going to have a much different question than your fleet manager is going to have. And your finance manager is okay, how much is this going to cost me? Your fleet manager is okay, is my fleet going to be up and running? And then your facilities or your energy manager might be what is the impact to, either building load or how are we going to get this constructed? They're all going to have different questions, but when you can, kind of be able to give them the information that they need in a way that's consistent, you can answer, kind of those questions along the way. And anecdotally, one of the things that we find is really useful, and it's something small, but can actually be really impactful, is doing a ride and drive with your folks, with your stakeholders, actually getting a few vehicles there, maybe even having a demo charging station there too. And, giving folks vehicles for a day or two, or even a few hours. And once they get in the vehicles and they realize, oh, okay, this isn't so different than I thought it was, it can really go a long way in terms of driving some of that buy-in and getting those questions answered. But I think, to build on what Ken was saying, everybody's question is different, and you want to make sure it gets answered in a way that can really be able to, make them feel like this is a transition that they can be part of. And for all of us that are even on the phone, I think we're all part of this energy transition. We're kind of talking about it overall, but it's not just a, kind of just one decision. It's an organizational change management decision with a clean energy future. And so it's all these pieces that you have to think about along the way.
Those are all really great suggestions, Megan. I like the idea of getting everyone in the same room and also having one-on-ones depending on what the preferences of which department you're working with. And so in that same vein, when you're having these critical conversations with all these key departments, finance, procurement, fleet, et cetera, what would you say are some of the more critical proof points that you need to develop internally in order to get everyone on board? Is there anything in particular, would you say that it's more important to start with finance? Is it more important to start with fleet? How should say a company on the line right now is considering pitching this idea internally? What should they even start with? Or should it be more developing an educational packet for themselves to then share with all these various departments, outlining all these elements together?
I hate to say that there's any one size that would fit everybody. I think first and foremost, sort of your operations and fleet teams, folks who are responsible, if we're talking specifically about EVs themselves, I think understanding how you're using your equipment truly in a day-to-day basis. How are you using the equipment? How far do you drive? What are the drive cycles? What kinds of products are out there in the market that are an appropriate fit, let's say, to your operation? And even kind of just roughly sketching, does this even look like something we can do? I think there are some fleets that are really struggling and say, there are folks that do certain kinds of jobs that would say, I don't have the turnaround time. If I have a piece of equipment that I operate 24 hours a day, I don't have the turnaround time, or I don't have the range. And there are definitely some harder technical challenges to overcome than others. But assuming that you've got that piece, I mean, I think having the finance folks lined up to understand that, probably here in the near term, this is an investment in the future, and you have to look at it that way. There are going to be far and few between, I think, applications where somebody is going to go out and buy an EV and, be net positive, in the first year or two or three. I think it's a little bit longer game than that. So you have to make sure that finance and your senior leadership are sort of bought into the idea that they're doing something for their company's brand equity that is a longer term investment. So I think finance is a big one. You can't underestimate the challenge, I think, in terms of navigating the infrastructure issue, right? So for some fleets, it's going to be heavily reliant upon understanding what is available in the public domain in terms of publicly accessible commercial charging infrastructure from some of the big names that we know. And then for some kinds of fleets, and I have a blend of both of these things, there are parts of my fleet that are highly, depot focused. And so electrifying facilities becomes a big piece, and the conversations that need to be had with your real estate team, and that you or your real estate team need to then have with, external contractors, the utility companies, and lining up what does the timeline look like to be able to accomplish this. Those are some of the biggest things that you say, you can gain all the other buy-in, you can have all the ride and drives that you want, but if you can't really figure out how you're going to finance it, or you can't really figure out what the planning horizon looks like for the physical implementation, if you're in a situation where you need to build your own infrastructure, you're kind of adrift in the water anyway. So it's almost like, I don't want to say that those things don't matter, but they matter in parallel. And there are probably others that are, those first couple are kind of your keystone issues. Are there products available? Is finance bought in? Are your real estate and utility partners, ready to support you from an infrastructure standpoint, or your third-party infrastructure providers, if it's talking to an EA or an EVgo or somebody like that, in terms of how you're going to get access to a charging network.
Yep, absolutely. And actually, both Megan and oh my goodness, Megan and Ken, I was looking right at your last name, are members of our corporate EV Alliance, and we conducted a survey, a zero emission vehicle demand aggregation survey last year, which we in January released a full report on. If you're interested, it's on the series website. But we found that, while public infrastructure for charging is essential, and we do still need to build out more of that charging on interstates and communities in rural areas and beyond, most of the charging that fleets are going to be doing on average, not necessarily on a one-on-one basis, will be done at private locations, whether that's at a depot site, whether that's at an employee's house. So it is really important to kind of get all those ducks in a line up front to figure out, how are we going to charge these vehicles? You should definitely plan for the future, not just for your first round of replacement vehicles that you're swapping your ICE models with new EVs for. You should be thinking down the line 5 years, 10 years beyond, at your ideal goal for fleet electrification, to determine how many chargers you need to build out within your depot sites and what level of chargers those should be, so that you're not paying those costs on a regular basis. You're just, setting yourself up for success down the line. Megan, did you want to add on what Ken said earlier?
Yeah, I was going to say too, and one other thing that we've seen a key to success, not only, in terms of those stakeholders, is like if you can get an executive champion, that is always helpful to have somebody who can really help, if you're, somebody who at an executive level is really bought in. And that could come from the sustainability target, but it could be your finance champion or treasury or whoever it might be that could be your champion. And Sarah, you hit on something that's really great, because it's not only just I love what Ken was talking about in terms of like, when you're building that roadmap, make sure you're also building the financial mechanisms in there. What often happens that we see is that it might be that short-sighted planning, that you're maybe planning for, I can get a pilot off the ground and maybe I can get the vehicles, but there hasn't been like the charging that's been thought about as well. And making sure that it's not just developing budgets and financial projections for 1 year or 2 year, it is that like 5-10 year projection, because it is going to be an investment over time that, the fleet will see and the organization will see that payback over time. One thing, Sarah, that you hit on too, is like, that's the one piece that we focus on a lot with the work that we do, is like, yes, get the buy-in on the vehicles, make sure that you have the technology that you need to meet your fleet operations, but really be thinking about that charging strategy in parallel, because you might be able to deploy charging like 1 or 2 chargers off of building power, but that's really only going to get you so far. You really need to think, what happens when you have 100 vehicles that are electrified? What if some of them need fast charging? What your facility can accommodate today is probably not what it's going to be able to accommodate once more of your fleet is electrified. Now, that's not to say it's not an impossible hurdle to overcome, but it just takes some planning. And when you do that, when you have that integrated approach, you can engage your utility early, which we can talk about too, your electric utility early. But in doing so too, rather than just having kind of a short-term financial plan, if you have a more long-term projection, you can start to think about, how do I take advantage of potentially some incentive funding that's out there? How do I take advantage of utility programs that are out there? Like, when you're not thinking just about, the near-term deployment and the longer term, you can start to phase that and start to think about that transition over time. And that it's all going to change. Like we like to say, iterate, know that it's going to change, know that vehicle technology is going to evolve. Things might change in terms of your operations. And it's totally possible to do that. But when you kind of have that integrated, technology roadmap planning with your financial planning, it can make it far more successful in the long term.
Yeah, and question for both of you. I mean, would you see, I know this session is focused on getting internal buy-in, but it seems like getting internal buy-in is very similar to developing a transition plan as well, that kind of they should be done in concert, and maybe they're part of the same process. I'm interested, would you think of them as separate, or should you kind of have this all figured out as you're pitching this to your internal departments?
They do tend to go together, at least in my experience, because I think just from a practical sense, there are questions that you almost need to anticipate from some of your internal stakeholder groups that may be a little bit more hesitant or kind of taking that wait and see approach. And it's not totally uncommon, I guess, for folks to kind of throw out well, what about XYZ? So I think to kind of have that conscious plan that you kind of are putting feelers out and you're working with all the stakeholders to say, how do I answer that question that's inevitably going to come someplace else that may not have anything to do with what you were asking about? So, I'm making up a hypothetical scenario here, but, if I were to ask my operations team, about their thoughts on sort of the transition, and, folks are sometimes apt to kind of throw out the red herrings about things that they heard that are going to make this not work. It's certainly helpful. It certainly gives you a position of credibility to be able to say, we've already started tapping into those channels. So before we even talked about what vehicles we were going to order, we had already started tapping into channels with our utility partners and saying, how would we really do this? How hard is this really from a scale of 1 to 10? And, is it monolithic? Is it as difficult as the worst case scenarios that you've heard? Are there cases where it's relatively easy to do it? I won't say easy, but relatively easier to do it. And there's cases where it's going to be harder. And that gives you a more educated way to sort of answer that question when it inevitably comes down the line from some other stakeholder from whom you weren't necessarily looking for that particular part of the input, but it builds the credibility to be able to say you've already had the conversation.
And I'd say too, like we find if you can get that buy-in, like when you're developing that roadmap, like have people come, it's going to be I will say it's going to be messy. It's going to be a little bit messy. You're going to have a lot of cooks in the kitchen. You're going to have a lot of different opinions, but it will lead to kind of a smoother transition as you roll it out, because you've gotten people internalize the decision. They understand the decision. You get that early. You do have more cooks in the kitchen. You do have, you do need to, kind of understand those different perspectives that are going to come into it. But when it comes to, okay, great, we've aligned around the plan. Here's how we're going to deploy. Here's our roadmap. Here's how it's going to transition over time. Those folks, whether it's your fleet team, your facilities team, your finance team, they know what their role is and they know how to execute on what the plan is, which I think can make it quite a bit easier. We always find too that you feel like you've covered all your bases. You're like, I've identified every single stakeholder that could possibly be impacted. There is always somebody that's going to come out of the woodwork and be like, wait, I have a view. I have a view on this too. I have an opinion on this. So just know that that's going to happen. Welcome people to the party, like more perspectives, and say like, okay, this is where we're at. Just know that that's going to be part of the process. But I think that when you have that internal alignment and get those people in the room early who can be part of co-creating that plan, it'll lead to a more smooth transition once you get to like actually ordering vehicles and deploying charging.
Those are all really good points, Megan and Ken. And I'm wondering, I don't know if
maybe I could just add one little bit there to what Megan said, and I saw one of the questions in the Q&A kind of allude to this. I think one of the other things that's important as you're kind of developing that plan and stakeholdering is to think sort of beyond the immediacy of what happens in the transition, what happens after the transition, right? So, maintainability, who's going to be responsible? That's actually one of the questions that we talked about. I see there's a question in here. Who's going to be responsible for the EVSEs? Who's responsible for plugging in the vehicles? There are all those things that are not day 0, day 1, but they're day 100, post transition, that you kind of go, are we really comfortable with sticking with this? And have we really kind of thought through who's going to do what? So definitely an important piece of the plan too.
Yep. Really good point. And I'm curious, I know that we're talking about, getting potentially from the fleet manager's perspective, going to all of these other departments to get them on board. But is there any angle that you've heard of where bringing in someone from the C-suite early on is helpful, so that there's already been kind of a decision made at the top of the company that this needs to happen? And then there's potentially more of a collaborative feeling between all these different departments, like we have to figure this out. Let's work it together to achieve this goal. Have either of you heard of any company doing that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are some cases where it's sort of being driven by the fleet sort of as a grassroots up, right? So the fleet organization is driving it. It may be your drivers and employees that are driving it. In some cases, it's the C-suite driving it. I certainly think, there's an argument to be made. You want to see a little bit of traction in all of those arenas happening at the same time. I don't think it's ever a great idea to really have something that is only being driven from one of those three corners. But it definitely helps when it happens at the C-suite, because I think there's a little bit more, impetus to look at this as a challenge statement and say, let's put all the things on the table in terms of what can we do to fulfill that objective, as opposed to let's figure out how many different ways we can poke holes in it, right? So I think when somebody says we're going to reduce carbon or we're going to eliminate carbon by this date in the future, it sort of opens up the aperture in terms of how and when and what solutions you plan to implement in order to chip away at that. So we've got, perhaps in some regard, just as many irons in the fire around how do we be more efficient even with the ICE vehicles that we currently have until we get to that EV, as much as we have efforts, from our sourcing or real estate or other departments kind of working on what the transition will look like. Because you need to be doing both of those things, at the same time, at least for the near term.
Yeah, and I think that Ken hit on it too. It's like you need it at all levels, because you need to have the buy-in on the folks that are actually going to be day-to-day operating the vehicles, driving the vehicles. Like that is critical, because if folks are like, no, I don't want to do this, it's not going to be set up for success. But you need that top, executive level sponsorship too, so that when things get stuck, when decisions get stuck, or, you might need to move around budgets to make something happen, like having that executive to say, okay, I can help you clear pathways can be super, super, helpful and like the key to success, but it is across the board, is that you do need at all levels those that are going to be the day-to-day operators and those that are the ones that can clear pathways.
Absolutely. And so, and to answer one of these questions I see in the chat, somewhat related to the conducting life cycle assessments, obviously it's important to weigh, the emissions comparison between your current fleet and a potential electric fleet. Are there any tools that either of you would recommend that are helpful, or case studies that you would point folks to that are really helpful to create that emissions case and then also that business case on return on investment?
I don't have them at my fingertips. I can send that out, and maybe we can distribute it to the folks that have been part of this. I've seen a number of those studies. So I mean, they are, to that question, it is something that we have kind of rattling around in the back of our minds. Is there is sort of that direct impact on emissions, and then there are sort of these tangential things when you look at the entirety of the supply chain. You're starting to see more of the auto companies kind of reporting on sort of their carbon intensity to manufacture. So when you think about sort of, it's not just the operation of the vehicle, but what went into the manufacture of it. So I think, there have definitely been lots of studies that have kind of, drawn bigger or more narrow scopes around, is it the direct emission of the vehicle, or do you look at, the totality of what has to happen, at the grid level, what has to happen from a manufacturing standpoint, from a natural resources standpoint, what happens to the old vehicle? Do you really take the old vehicle off the road? Are certain things allowed to just normally attrit? There's a number of different approaches. And so I think you end up coming up with, I don't know that there's any one way to say and stamp certified that this is the answer, but I think you can arm yourself with sort of scenarios and saying, well, if we look at it this way, these numbers would bear this out. If I introduce these other things, it puts a margin of error plus or minus 10% around what I said. And if we still believe that that's the right way to go, even with inside those boundaries, regardless of which scenario you're saying is the right one, you're still, directionally correct for your efforts. So I think that's dealing with the risk and the unknown of some of these, more macro issues that go around the transition. It can either be sort of the thread in the sweater that people pull on, or you can frame them as sort of, yeah, we don't exactly know how this is going to turn out, but I mean, even if you play it out to either extreme, it's directionally better than what we're doing. So, I've seen a number of folks take that approach.
Valid point. And I'll also add that I just saw actually this morning, the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, just released an assessment on a comparison of a life cycle assessment between a conventional petroleum vehicle and a battery electric vehicle. And it turns out that on an average grid mix, I believe, don't quote me on this, EVs are still 50% cleaner emissions wise, or life cycle assessment wise, than conventional vehicles. And that includes upstream production. So I encourage everyone to go check out that NREL report that was just released, and we can try to track down the name of that as well. So I'll pass it off to Megan to talk about any tools that you found helpful for fleets to use.
Yeah, there's certain tools out there like total cost of ownership, as we've talked about it a little bit. Like that's one that I think folks really like, of the comparative between, on the vehicle side, total cost of ownership of a gas vehicle versus an electric vehicle. It's something we use often. We find it builds that business case. The one piece that Ken was talking about too around, life cycle assessments, it's not only just kind of pairing the fleet transition with maybe total cost of ownership, cost, and carbon reduction, but likely your overall sustainability strategy, your carbon accounting, so that or you're at least tracking, if you're moving from scope 1 to scope 2 and scope 3, like how all of those emissions are impacting it. And this is where it goes to that coordinated effort and making sure that that reporting is in line, because as it moves as emissions move from scope 1 in your gas fleet into scope 2 when it's an electric fleet, your energy manager, their energy procurement strategy is going to change. They want to be able to account for that, because they want to make sure that they're sourcing enough energy to cover this new load that's coming from from electric vehicles charging potentially at facilities. And so there's some ways to not only think about tools that are, on the fleet side and potentially charging side for total cost of ownership, but how do you wrap that into, kind of overall carbon accounting that might be happening in your organization? And we find oftentimes our work, what we do is we'll pair our transportation electrification team with our sustainability team, with our energy supply team, because they're so intertwined, and that also mirrors typically on the organizations that's transitioning their side as well.
That's a great point, Megan. Thank you for that really helpful suggestion. And if folks are looking for a helpful tool to conduct a total cost of ownership assessment or comparison between some vehicles that they're thinking about, I would encourage everyone to take a look at the Argonne National Labs A-Fleet tool. That has been incredibly helpful. I used to support the DOE Clean Cities program, and that's one of the main tools that we suggested to folks who are looking to see a comparison between the carbon intensity of certain vehicles or the costs across the board. So that will allow you to bake in any charging infrastructure costs, any fuel costs based on your region of the country. It'll tap into electricity costs, all based on the GREET model. So take a look at that. But we have about 1 minute left. So I want both Megan and Ken to leave one word of advice for everyone for a company just starting out down this road. What would you advise, your top tip?
Start early and think broadly.
Yeah, I would say similarly, plan and right size. Think about, I won't go any farther, but plan and right size what you're doing.
Yeah, I saw one comment in the chat about, downstream emissions, to this point, thinking through, the EV transition is a piece of it, but I think where you need buy-in, across your enterprise is that you're going to do things that are not related to the vehicle. So, I think that's a great point, is if the transition results in people producing vehicles to go do things that they wouldn't have otherwise done had it not been the transition, then maybe you could argue that's not really a net gain for the world. And so, we always say that in fleet world, I always say the greenest mile traveled is the greenest mile is the one you didn't travel in the first place. So looking at your operation and saying, what can I peel back? What could be delivered in other ways, in more efficient ways than a truck roll, kind of transcends what does the EV truck transition look like, is what does the transition of work look like?
Yep, that's a great last note to end on. Right-sizing your fleet and optimizing your route are critical as you're continuing to consider alternative fuel technologies like electric vehicles. So with that, a huge thank you to our panelists today, Megan Weinman and Ken Jack from Verizon and Edison Energy. Thank you so much for your time and your fantastic expertise. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
for having us.